Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. It's Friend or Foe Friday, and I'm going to be taking a look at the Vegepygmy, as voted for by our Twitter poll. And you've probably already noticed before we get started that I'm not joined by my lovely wife, Hannah, as normal. And that is because, well, we've had to record this a little bit late just because we've been quite busy this week. And the way our work schedules rarely sync up, unfortunately, we weren't both available to talk about it. And since Hannah's working late, I said I'll record the episode and then hopefully we can get back to doing it the normal sort of duo thing next week. So I'm afraid you're just going to have to make do with me for this one episode. So the Vegepygmy appears in the AD&D Monster Manual 2, first edition by Gary Gygax. And in here it says they're vegetable creatures of low intelligence. They organise themselves into regional bands and live by scavenging and hunting. Apparently they vary in colour and size, although normally their colour sort of matches the vegetation and such like in their surroundings. We're told that their height is directly related to their hit dice, those with one hit dice being 2 feet tall and a half a foot getting added for every hit dice over 1. As with a lot of creatures in the sort of first edition ones, it gives you a bit of a breakdown of their sort of structure and, you know, if they're going to have leaders. So we're told for every 50 Vegepygmies, there's one sub-chief of 5 hit dice and 2 to 5 bodyguards of 3 hit dice each. Every band has a leader of 6 hit dice and he has 2 to 8 bodyguards of 4 hit dice each. We're told they only take 1 point of damage from piercing weapons, due to their sort of vegetable nature and not having internal organs in the same way as an animal creature would do. Electrical attacks do no damage, again for the same reason. Fire and cold do normal damage, and they're immune to all charm and enchantment spells except for those that affect plants. They always have saving throws against enchantment, even when one is not normally given. They normally lair in dark, warm underground areas, although some may be found in dark forests, and they tend to form bands near their main food supply. They're short bipedal creatures with sharp thorn-like claws, and they have sort of like leafy frill-like tendrils around their shoulders and abdomens, etc. So nice to see even the plants are preserving a little bit of their modesty there. And we get a little sort of black and white picture, as is typical of the artwork in the first edition monster manuals. It shows this weird sort of bug-eyed plant creature with a slightly sort of drawn and leathery-looking complexion, and it's holding a crude stone axe. We then move on to the second edition Monster Manual, and so let's see what the Vegepygmy's got in here. It's been rechristened the Mould Man. The stats are pretty much the same, although we're now told that the Vegepygmy sort of label is a derogatory term, and they're short bipedal fungus-like creatures. And obviously we know in sort of real life that funguses are different from normal plants, but I think that's a little bit academic for D&D. Although, let's face it, us old schoolers, we do love our weird funguses and our mushrooms in our games, so why not? Again, their colour matches their surrounding. They don't have a spoken language, we're now told, but they are capable of vocalised cries. They normally communicate by tapping on their chests and on trees or stone, so that's a nice little bit of extra flavour there. The descriptions of their sort of society and their leaders, etc., is pretty much the same. They still only take 1 point of damage from piercing weapons, and they've got all the immunities, etc., that they had previously. We get a little bit extra on their habitat and society in the second ed version. We're told they form primitive settled tribes. They coexist well with plants and fungus life. They often use shriekers to guard their lair, and mould men native to the lair can pass by these shriekers unnoticed. Normally we're told that russet moulds are also found in their vicinity, which might go some way to explaining why they've been sort of redefined as mould men, because you can link them all in with all their moulds and stuff like that. They also have been known to associate with myconids, obviously the mushroom men, which view them as sort of like rustic cousins. So I find it quite interesting to think of like the sort of myconids see like Vegepygmies as like their sort of like hillbilly sort of like cousins. So I think you could definitely get some story mileage out of that. We're told that they live by scavenging and hunting. They'll eat meat in any condition from fresh to rancid. In times of great need, they've even been known to eat others of their own kind, or even myconids, although they seldom attack members of their own tribe. Then the next book that I own that I could find mention of them in, and they might have appeared in other editions and other books that I just don't have, but the next book I've got with them in is the Volo's Guide to Monsters for 5th edition. And once again, they get back to being called Vegepygmies rather than Mould Men. I mean, sometimes I wish D&D would just like make its mind up on what it wants to call things and stick with it, but never mind. They're still fungus people, although it does say they're also called mould folk or mouldies, although it's not in the title here. They instinctively have a kinship with other plants and fungus creatures, as previously. They get on well with myconids, shriekers, and now violet fungi, we're told. They prefer to eat fresh meat, bone and blood. They can absorb nutrients from the soil and many other sorts of organic matter, so they rarely go hungry, but it seems to suggest via the tone here that they prefer that fresh meat, if you know what I mean. They don't build and craft much. They communicate by tapping, as we've said previously, although they have been known to copy or imitate simple constructions that they've witnessed. Now, we get an interesting little bit extra here. We're told that they originate from the remains left behind when a humanoid or giant is killed by a russet mould. One or more Vegepygmies emerge from the corpse a day later, which is quite interesting because we didn't really get anything like this before, but it's interesting to know where they come from. We're told that as the Vegepygmies age, they grow tougher and they develop spore clusters on their bodies. Spore-bearing Vegepygmies are deferred to by others of their kind, so outsiders refer to them as chiefs. A chief can expel its spores in a burst, infecting nearby creatures. If a creature dies while infected, its corpse produces Vegepygmies in the same way a russet mould does. So they've actually got two different ways of spreading here, one deliberate and one a little bit more haphazard and accidental. And we're given 3 stat blocks here, as is often the way with 5th edition. You get various sort of like power boosted versions of the stat blocks. We get your basic Vegepygmy, which has like 9 hit points. It's a small neutral plant, gets advantage on dex when it's in terrain with plants because of its camouflage. It regenerates 3 hit points at the start of its turn, so it looks like they've got rid of a lot of the immunities here. They've still got a few resistances to like lightning and piercing damage, but obviously that's a lot less effective than the sort of you only take 1 hit point of damage from piercing weapons. And they had a whole raft of immunities in the earlier editions. But in this one, they have some resistances, but they are going to be regaining hit points each round. So I think that's to sort of balance out the reduction in the immunities. They can attack with claws or crude slings. We then have a stat block for a Vegepygmy chief, who has 33 hit points. They have the same abilities, although their regeneration is bumped up a little bit. And once a day, they can send out a 15-foot radius cloud of toxic spores. Each creature in the area that isn't a plant must succeed on a DC 12 Constitution save or be poisoned. Whilst poisoned in this way, you take 2d8 poison damage at the start of each turn. A target can repeat the saving throw at the end of each turn, ending the effect on itself on a success. And then we get an interesting little stat block for something called a Thorny, which I'm judging by the picture, which shows this, again, something that's quite reminiscent of the first ed picture of this bug-eyed sort of plant man. But it has this weird sort of almost like hound-like plant sort of faux shambling mound creature with it, which I assume is the Thorny. And that basically has 27 hit points, has the plant camouflage, has sort of boosted regen, but and at the start of its turn it deals 1d4 piercing damage to any creature grappling it because it is covered in these thorns. And I've got to admit, this is probably one of the few sort of creatures that I've seen where I've actually really loved the 5th edition artwork, and I thought it was actually superior to some of the earlier editions. And it doesn't actually seem like they're trying to fill up a load of pages. I mean, this is a double page spread, but you only have like a fairly small picture, 3 stat blocks, about half a page worth of background, but there is a nice little box out which talks about russet mould, which is basically used as a natural hazard or a trap, and given that they've sort of linked the two of them together, it's nice to see that getting a little bit of expansion. Okay, so a few ways I can think of that you could probably use Vegepygmies, or mould men if you prefer, in your games are, first of all, I think they could be used to make an encounter with myconids or other types of plant more interesting. Now, we're all familiar with the sort of adorable or lovable fungus men shambling around with their telepathic spores and sort of looking after plants and whatever, but they're pretty samey, to be perfectly honest. Aside from minor tweaks in stats, myconids are all pretty samey. So throwing in these Vegepygmies could just be an interesting extra bit of variety that you could add into an encounter, since they fill a very sort of similar ecological niche, for want of a better term, to the myconids. You could also, given that the Vegepygmies are portrayed as being a bit more primitive and a bit more tribal, as we've said in sort of previous episodes when we've been talking about sort of tribal creatures, you could always pit the myconids against the Vegepygmies in some sort of conflict and just sort of like have the player characters wander into the middle of it. You don't have to set up in advance like what the player characters are supposed to do. Just set up the situation. These two tribes are fighting with each other for whatever reason. There might be myconids and Vegepygmies. There might be two tribes of Vegepygmies. Whatever floats your boat. But you can just set up this conflict. You know, maybe they're conflicting because there's a particularly large sort of mold-friendly patch of terrain that is going to allow whatever Vegepygmy tribe that possesses it to create more of their number and expand vastly and become the dominant mold men in the area. So perhaps there's two tribes competing. As when we were talking about frogmen in a previous episode, you could have the Vegepygmies come from slightly different sort of areas, and their coloration and their physical makeup could reflect that. So maybe, to use this sort of scenario, perhaps this sort of patch of mold-friendly terrain, maybe it's on the border between some mountains and some jungle. Now, obviously, different vegetation grows in mountains and grows in jungles, so the Vegepygmies that sort of rise up in that area will have different colorations and physical makeup to camouflage themselves better within their sort of particular ecological niche, and that'll make it easier for the player characters to sort of differentiate between them, and also it'll give them a sort of idea that when they first bump into this scenario, oh, maybe there's more than one group of them, maybe they're not sort of aligned with each other, and then they can go on to further investigation, rather than just seeing some Vegepygmies and just being like, oh, it's some mold men, and thinking they're all sort of one homogenous bunch. Another way I think they could be used is, as I said earlier on, I love the idea that the myconids look on the sort of Vegepygmies as like they're slightly rustic, in inverted commas, cousins, and I think that could be a fun thing, you know, if the player characters have established like a rapport with a group of myconids, maybe they're like, oh yeah, we'd like you to do us this favour, we'd like you to retrieve this special fertiliser or this item or whatever for us, and they're like, oh, that's not a problem, and where do we need to get it? And they're like, oh, yeah, actually it's out in the swamps with our cousins. And you can, obviously you don't have to play up all the sort of hick stereotypes, but you could have a lot of fun with running the mold men as having very different priorities to the myconids. So obviously in this hypothetical example, I'm sort of imagining the myconids as being like the slightly more urbane, sort of civilized, in inverted commas, plant people, and the Vegepygmies are the slightly more sort of primitive, back to nature sort of types. But you could tweak that, you could play around with that as you see fit. I do really love as well, for another thing to talk about, this link with molds and various different plants that have been sort of like built upon and really sort of honed in on in 5th edition. And I really love the fact that they've done that, because molds and sort of slimes and stuff like that, they're often fun as sort of gotcha monsters and traps. You know, I mean, I used some recently. I used some orange sludges out of the Hot Springs Island book, and they were on a ceiling. The player characters went underneath. They dropped down on them. It was a bit of a trap. They managed to burn them off the person who got covered in this orange sludge, and they went on their way. But they don't really have a lot to them beyond this use as a trap. And apologies if you can hear some noise outside. The person who lives out the back of me is seemingly like rebuilding their entire porch, so apologies for that. But yeah, these molds and these slimes, they don't actually have a lot of interest or facility for use beyond traps or the quick sort of gotcha, whereas having the Vegepygmies sort of worked in with them and sort of built in with an ecology with these sort of slimes lends them an extra depth and makes them seem more just like, oh, it's just a quick trap that the gem's dropped in to like tax us some hit points or whatever. So if you come across some russet molds or whatever type of molds are your preference, and at first you think, oh yeah, it's just a trap, and then later you find out they're in this weird sort of symbiotic relationship with this Vegepygmy tribe that's nearby, it not only gives a reason for both the Vegepygmies and the moulds being where they are in your game, but it also makes your world feel a little bit more lived in and have a little bit more sort of depth and three-dimensionality to it. Because rather than you've just dropped a couple of random plant monsters in because this is the plant bit of the dungeon, you've now sort of hinted that there's actually a deeper ecology and sort of method behind it, even if there isn't. But sometimes the mere hint is enough to give that extra depth to your game. So there's some ideas for using the Vegepygmy in your games. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Hopefully we'll have Hannah back with us next time. If you'd like to leave us a message, maybe be featured in a future voicemail episode, you can do so in a few different ways. You can leave us a voicemail using the SpeakPipe website. There's a link in the description of this show. Or if you're having trouble with that, we still have our old Anchor link, again, link in the description below, which you can use to send us a voicemail, or you could drop us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and happy gaming.